All right, hey folks, so it's Faz from Fazlifts. Today I'm going to be detailing my advanced strength methods. So I wanted to put this out there as an outline of how I train my very strong guys and girls to get stronger and where this originates from. So this video came up as a conversation that I had on Alexander Bromley's channel, where he was interviewing me regarding strength and also how I coach my clients. And I thought I would follow up on that and just sort of detail a bit more with illustrations and with slide notes, kind of a bit more about my method. Now, I might release this as an ebook at some point. I've not yet. All of my ebooks that I've released are things that I've personally had experience with over the course of many years. So the Wizard, Tactician, these are all things which are my personal experience. If I do release this will be the first time I've released an ebook which is based on my coaching methods, as in how I coach other people, and not what I've done on myself. So it's a little more thought involved in that, I think. If just thinking of integrity, I just want to be certain it's the right time to do it. But it's probably going to come out very soon, I imagine. So let's begin. Now, so in terms of my history, so when I first got into sort of the later stages of my powerlifting, the last few years, the big conversation that we were all having back then, back in the UK, was this sort of fight almost of methods between high specificity at very high loads versus more generalization at lower percentages. To simplify, it was essentially the Bulgarian system versus the Chinese system. Did you go ultra specific on the lifts repeatedly, mostly for very high specificity in terms of percentage and also the actual lift you did? Or did you go more sort of low percentages, repeated efforts, potentially with varying the exercises, both of which have their pros and cons? Ultimately, now looking back, I sort of realized that the difference was really weighing up quicker progress and ultimately burning out faster versus slower progress and potentially not hitting your peak or being able to live for longer. That was the conversation, essentially. So the basis of my strength methods in the past was maximum effort lifts. So I would go to 100%, sometimes beyond. And these were usually on very close variations of the lifts. I didn't vary things much. So my main variations were the stiff leg deadlift, the high bar back squat, and the close grip bench. That's it. There wasn't much else really done. And if you think of all the bench variations we have now, which we know are useful, hardly used any of them. I mostly exclusively did the close grip bench. Same with the deadlift variations. There's a ton of good deadlift variations out there. I mostly did the stiff leg deadlift, to the point where the stiff leg deadlift was regularly about 90% of my deadlift. I mean, looking back now, I see the silliness of that, and I should have varied things a lot sooner. Now, this is what my Tactician version 2 is based on. And that's what got me personally very strong. What I'm going to detail in this video is the system which I've created as a result of the modifications I've put into place to improve the system for my clients. Mostly this is all in the name of being safer. Now, I do call it my conjugate style of training, but I don't know. I don't have any massive allegiance towards conjugate style training or West Side training or whatever. You'll see why I've made these changes. They're all very logically based, and each one is evaluated on its own. This is not an ode to West Side. This is not an ode to conjugate. I don't give a crap about being known as a conjugate trainer or whatever. This is just changes I've made to make things safer, to allow lifters to be able to live for longer and still have similar to the same results. So with that said, let's move forward and actually look at the system. Now, the very first thing that we identified back in the day was we couldn't really argue past the point that we should maintain some ability to stay in touch with heavy absolute loads. You're a powerlifter. You need to retain the ability to lift competition-esque loads on a regular basis. You may even be able to improve the ability to handle those loads over time. Like, you ask your typical powerlifter who sticks to the 10 to 15 rep range year round to do a single max on the bench, it's going to be a disaster. You need to have lifting heavy, as in a higher percentage of your 1 rep max or close to maximum load. It's a skill. You would be hard pressed to argue against that. And that was the conclusion we came to back then. And it was this idea that, you know, we were moving away from the block periodization routes, the linear routes, which had people not handling heavy loads for most of the year. This came from a revolt away from that. You have to bear in mind, guys, we're in 2022 now. This is all very commonplace. But back then, the conversation really was, hey, we should be doing block periodization. This month or this next 2 months, you're just going to be doing 8s and 10s. And people thought that was great. Or you're going to start the training cycle with sets of 12 and you're going to end 16 weeks later with sets of 1 and 2. That was actually the conversation. So it was a dramatic step away from that. But that's the first thing we realized back then was, okay, we've got to move away from that. That's not helping us. We are losing the ability to lift heavy while we're building up volume loads. So we're getting greater 8s, but we're not necessarily getting the transfer that we want. So the downsides were that the lifter loses the ability to perform one skill while they're learning another. So the solution for me, rather than max out on the specific lifts, was to max out on a highly specific list of exercises. So we were new to this, and we were varying. Rather than a competition squat, I might do the high bar back squat. Rather than a bench, I might do the close grip bench. Rather than a deadlift, I might do the stiff leg deadlift. The problem with that was when you become, I mean, it's so silly now I think about it. It's so obvious. But the problem with that was when you become so specific on those lifts, because that's all you do most of the year, well, in a sense, they become your power lifts because you get so good at them. My high bar back squat, my close grip bench, my stiff leg deadlift were literally within 10% of my competition lifts. So it makes me laugh now that I think about it. I should have realized that and switched to harder variations. But as it is, that was what the community was doing. So now my solution is to broaden that out massively to anywhere between 6 to 18 variations across the course of the year. This keeps the lifter safer because every time you get very, very good at one variation, you switch it around. You build your strength in another variation and you stay with that for a while. And I might stay with 3 at a time, but they get dropped in and out as they need to. So had I nowadays, I'll do something like for a raw bencher, I might do feet up bench press. I might do a 3 count pause bench, and then I might do a close grip bench. So 3 pretty different lifts. And that's where I'll start. I'll have them doing those one by one, week per week. And then we'll repeat the 3 weeks. We'll see what changes, see what improves, see where we need to switch things around. And based on those results, you know, we'll take some in, we'll take some out. We'll just try and get good at them. But it certainly means there's far less repetitive stress and just getting really efficient at 1 or 2, or in this case, 3 highly specific variations. Now, there is some argument as to whether doing these variations will let you get away with, you know, whether there is more safe or not. And, you know, because you're in the end, you're still going to have to handle heavy loads. Well, yeah, that's true. You can never make it safe. And note that I don't say safer. I don't say safe. I say safer. So I'm aiming for 6 to 18 variations rather than 3. I'm not saying this is going to make it safe. You cannot remove the dangers of absolute load. You can only make things slightly safer. And that's all this does. It just means you never get really, really efficient at one main exercise variation. You're constantly switching. You're getting the benefits of multiple ones. That's good. It works as a crescendo and everything rises together. So, yeah, I think it's a valid criticism to say, you know, are we any safer by varying things? It's fine. It's good to point that out. And I would say it's half and half. I would say you are going to be definitely safer than if you specialize on one variation. However, you can never remove the dangers of absolute load. You can't. If your 3 count pause bench is 3 or 4 plates, you know, if your feet up bench is 3 or 4 plates, I'm sorry, it's gonna be risky no matter what. So you can't remove the dangers of absolute load. But this at least is one way that I discovered to minimize those risks while still getting the benefit of handling heavy loads. Because the idea is you've still got to handle heavy loads. We just vary things more to enable us to stay in touch with the heavy weights all year round. That's all it is. It's not a perfect system, but it's an improvement to what we were doing 12, 10 years ago. Okay, next. This is something which has remained unchanged. This is exercise potentiation progression across the off-season. It's a long title. The reason why it's a long title is no one's ever actually asked me to explain this before. So I just did it. So this is the best I could come up with. Exercise potentiation progression across the off-season. Basically what that means is this. I will go from a highly non-specific variation of a power lift to a much more specific variation over the course of an off-season. That's basically all it is. Now, this is what I used to do back then as well. So each phase, I work in 3-week blocks, so each phase will last between 3 to 6 weeks, maybe even 9, usually 6. Whereas what I would normally do is when I was back in the day, what I would have done is carried on just using the stiff leg deadlift and just got better and better at that. As I said, that has its problems. So I literally would have maxed on the stiff leg deadlift, then do reps on the stiff leg deadlift, whereas now I would max on a range of different exercises, like I pointed out in the previous slide, and the exercise potentiation progression would occur like this. I might start the off season with a very, very non-specific variation, a very light variation, like the deficit stiff leg deadlift with no belt. Okay, that is a pretty good variation. So instead of deficit, which makes it harder, no belt, which makes it harder. So you're forced to really tighten up your form. You can't brace into the belt. You're lifting on a deficit as well, so it's a longer range of motion. There's a lot of good stuff that's going on here, which is going to force you to lighten your load. So you spend a good 3, usually 6, maybe 9 weeks on this variation, getting better and better at it. Great. Okay. Then once you're really good at that, or as good as you're going to be in those weeks, you move on to the next variation, which is slightly more specific. And this is when you'd hit the stiff leg deadlift. And let's say now you'd probably also add a belt to the mix. Great. Stiff leg deadlift, and now we have a belt on. More specific. And you've already built a great foundation going from the stiff leg deadlift, and now you move into the deadlift. You built a great foundation on the deficit, and now you go into the stiff leg deadlift. So it allows you to have an increased rate of progression here. And generally you can progress on this pretty well because you built a lot of strength. And final phase is the conventional deadlift with a belt for sets of 8, which is pretty brutal. That's pretty cool. But remember, you're still retaining the ability to hit max singles because you're doing your variations on the other day. Okay, so you're putting in some good work. Now, whereas previously I used to do this phase with my 8, 5s, and 3s rep scheme. If you're not familiar with that, just Google Fazlifts 8, 5, and 3. Nowadays, though, I just do the traditional rep work, and I usually do a 3x8, straight up double progression. The reason is the 5s and 3s tends to beat people up because you've just done a max single or a 95% single. You don't want to go straight into sets of 3, and it just doesn't work how we need it to work. We've already stayed in touch with the max loads. We don't need to then do rep work with 3s. It's irrelevant. It doesn't make sense. You should either do the singles or you should do the 3s. For my money, the singles are far more specific and they're better at what you need, which is to stay in touch with heavy loads. I think the majority of the rep work, this exercise potentiation progression, should be done with relatively high reps because it's building work. So I like this just as a straight 3x8. By the way, I should add that in from the previous slide. You don't want the max singles on those variations to be all out maxes. They should be about 95%. Anyway, I'll come back to that. So yeah, that's the main variation. So far we've covered the max lift and we've covered the main variations. These are 2 parts of the program. Now the next part of the program is the light and competition lift. So when I was really getting into this late stage of my powerlifting, there was a large anti-West Side sentiment. Ironic in a sense. And it was this idea that you probably do have to include the competition lifts year round. So all the British lads were thinking, okay, this is one area where we all agreed, whether we were looking at Bulgarian methods, whether we were looking at more percentage-based methods, more linear methods, more block periodization. We all agreed we should probably, if we want to be able to squat well, we probably need to include the squat most of the year. Again, just like we should include the heavy loads most of the year. How do we do that? So it was conceded also that you couldn't hammer away at them heavy all year round. So the solution was to introduce them for light triples. That was the solution at the time. I would say at this point, you can't hammer away at any lift indefinitely. So whether it's the competition lifts or like I was doing, the highly specific variations, you shouldn't be hammering away at any one lift all year round. It's not good. You should vary things. So what I used to do was I used to do light triples. I don't think that's as productive, so I don't do that anymore with my clients. Now I've moved to doing 5x5 for squats and deadlifts or 6x6 for bench press with about 1 minute rest period. That's good. That works really well. Okay. The weight is light enough that you can progress on it pretty well. Like my 180 kilo benches are using about 120 for the speed work, for this 5x5, for this 6x6 work. It's pretty good. You know, a guy who benches four plates, he's using 2.5 plates for 6x6. That's good work, right? With 1 minute rest period. So it gives you an idea. The loads are pretty light, but they're good enough that they ingrain form and they still allow you to keep in touch with the bench, still allow you to lift for speed. And the guy who I'm thinking of, who just did the 180 bench, which is a lifetime PB of his, he's a very fast, explosive bencher, and I think it's probably got something to do with this. Now, when it comes to counting the load, I don't count these 5 sets as counting towards 5 sets of the total volume, because they do have a 1 minute rest period. So I count them as about 3 sets. But anyway, that is how I now do that. I don't do 8 triples anymore. I do 5x5 on squat and deadlift, or 6x6 on the bench. Occasionally, I will also do 6x6 on chins and pull-ups, but it depends on the client's goals. And the final thing is the repetition work. So this is something I borrow entirely from my experience as a competitive bodybuilder, using the volume landmarks to grow. Now, I think the old Louis and Westside way of doing things, it was trying to find special exercises. You remember like articles and articles talking about this special exercise, that special exercise. Now that's cool, like finding a specifically new variation, new angle on the tricep extension is great. But ultimately, what is a tricep extension? You're basically extending your arm, right? How many different ways can you do it, right? You can do it lying down, you can do it standing up, you can do it hanging from the ceiling, but ultimately it's an extension. Now, adding more volume, though, is a much more powerful lever we can pull. So we can tweak that lever. More volume is more, immediately you have more of a training effect. So that's how I like to do things. And also with that, I keep a track of my clients' volume totals for all areas. And I manipulate the volume up and down to produce a better result in the periodized exercise progression, the main variation. So in a weird way, as a modern day powerlifter, certainly with me, you almost have to wear both hats. You have to be both a bodybuilder and a powerlifter. You have to take advantage of your volume landmarks, and also you have to do all the powerlifting stuff. Does this all sound very complicated? Well, if it does, then you're probably not an advanced powerlifter. This is probably not the video for you. So stop watching, switch it off, like before you go. But for the rest of you who should be watching this, this is for advanced powerlifters. This is the next slide. So as a rough outline, this is kind of how I do things. So I will start with the ME day, the max effort day. I'll start with usually 3 lifts. Now they'll be rotated week by week. So you'll do 1 lift per day, not all 3 lifts. So you might do a 3-week rotation of the first week, feet up bench press, second week, close grip bench press, third week, 3 count. So 3 paused count bench press. Max, 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 week 1, week 2, week 3. Okay. Then the next block, you'll do the same 3 and you'll try and beat where you're at. Now, bear in mind, in those 3 weeks, you've been building and building and building with the rep work, with the exercise progression, all that stuff. And you should, well, every time that I've done it, someone has improved from week to week, which is great. So week 1, they'll hit the feet up bench. Week 4, they'll hit the feet up bench. They would have improved, which is great. Then after that max effort lift, which is done for a 95% single, it's not ever, I don't ever really encourage people to max out. 95% is enough. You don't need to go and fail for you to know like where you're at. Then I do the main variation, which is what we have as the continuity throughout the year. You know, the deficit stiff leg deadlift, the stiff leg deadlift, whatever. For bench presses, I have a different variations. I mean, you know, a typical one for bench is incline close grip, followed by close grip, followed by what else would I end with? Maybe paused or the actual bench for eights. You know, just so it's very specific. So that provides a continuity throughout the off season, and it's always different for every lift. Then we have the rep work. This is all on the ME day, and the rep work is more tied into the weekly volume. So we just start the rep work. It's everything else. It's basically it's most of the routine is rep work, and you just try and add in the volume to build everything else. Some of the advanced guys need a lot of volume, so they might need 16 to 18 to 20 sets per body part per week. So this is where all that goes, and we just try and get in some good quality work without spending too long in the gym. Okay, next up we have the DE days. A bit simpler, but it's just as long. The day is just as long. It's just that it's filled with more rep work. So you start off with the light or competition lifts, usually 5x5 for squat and deadlift, 6x6 for the bench, and then you go straight into your rep work, and you just fill out the reps from across the week. So nice and easy. Okay. So my kind of summary concluding thoughts. So yeah, the driving force here really is safety. Like, I want my lifters to lift for longer than I did, and ultimately I want them to do better. But so that's the driving force. It's safety. Safety is the number one concern. It's what takes people out of the game. Now, I will say though, you can't nullify the dangers of high load lifting entirely. So for every, not to call anyone out, but for every strength coach who's in their 20s and believes that their version of conjugate is guaranteed that they're going to live till their 50s, like Mowenning, I wish them luck, but they have to understand that as of right now, even if they have a very good strength pedigree, what they think is going to occur 20 years from now, it's a guess, right? No one tries to get hurt, guys, okay? So people have great ideas. Every young generation thinks they're going to improve on the older one, and a lot of times we do, but just bear in mind, you only know that your methods work for longevity when you're older. So don't be that guy who sat there in his 20s thinking, I'm going to lift heavy till I'm 50. I wish you the best of luck. Okay, but we all thought that, all right? Elite strength comes with risk. What I try and do is I try to mitigate that for longevity. And I would also say, finally, don't spend all your powerlifting year powerlifting. Okay, don't do it. Like my client who just recently hit a bunch of lifetime goals, we are now going to go on a long 3 to maybe 6 months of hypertrophy work to potentiate him for the next phase where we go back to strength. Now, it has an advantage. All that hypertrophy work that he's going to do, the sheer amount of reps, higher repetition work, is going to potentiate him for greater gains in strength down the road because he's going to come back a bigger individual. So it helps. It's time away, but ultimately it helps. It helps build your entire body so you can then peak that for a better strength later. But also it takes some stress off the joints, the tendons, mentally as well. So vary things. Don't be caught in the powerlifting trap forever. And again, it boils down to that thing that I say. No one tries to get hurt. So you think your system's perfect. You think you've accounted for every injury. You can't do that. So it behooves you to take some time away from strength altogether and focus on some bodybuilding for a while. It's good. Do it. You know, spend 6 months bodybuilding exclusively, then spend another 6 months peaking for powerlifting with all these things in play. You'll probably get further in the long run. So I'm just trying to help people not burn out, you know, not get injured. Because the more you can kind of drag this stuff out, you can carry on getting stronger for a long time. Just take it slow. Right, folks. Hopefully that was useful. As I say, I probably will turn this into an ebook at some point. And obviously, if you want coaching on this, you want to get cracking straight away, contact me and let me know. We can talk. But hopefully that was useful. And I will speak to you guys in the next one. Right. Just before I go, before I shut this down, I thought it might be helpful to add on what these days would look like, just as an example. So I'm going to give you a broad example. Because this is for advanced lifters, it's going to vary very much, you know, based on the individual, essentially, their volume requirements, their exercise requirements, stuff like that. So just take this as a very broad base example. I don't know how useful it is, but let's have a look. So this is kind of an example ME day. So we might go with a feet up bench press. It might be one of the 3 variations we're going to use in that block. That would go up to a 95% single. Okay. After that, we would do the main progressive potentiation exercise, which is the incline close grip bench. We hit that for about 3 by 8. That's the idea. Then we go on to our rep work. Pull-ups, 4 sets. Weighted dips, 4 sets. Chest supported row, 4 sets. So far, we've done around about 16 singles, which is 16 sets, which is a pretty good workout, you know, for strength work. That might take somebody 45 minutes to an hour, depending on how slow they move between sets. Then after that, if you have time, hit some delts, hit some arms. Particularly rear delts are important for balance, side are important, biceps are important for just to balance out the bench work. Triceps are important for elbow health. So it's all important stuff, stuff you should be doing. But that's the rough layout of an ME day. I thought it might help for people just to see an example day. Now, if we were to look at a dynamic day or DE day, just the lower days, one of the lower days, you might go with a squat for 5 by 5 and the deadlift variation. I sometimes go with the deadlift. I sometimes also go with a variation. It really depends on the lifter. Again, it's all about not burning people out, but practicing the competition lift. Squat, deadlift, both 5 by 5. Both of those with 1 minute rest, same as the bench. It would be for 6 by 6, 1 minute rest. Then maybe some leg press, maybe some leg curl. That's about 18 sets. Add in some calves, some abs. And again, this is very much just a template, which is why I didn't put the example in the first video, first half of the video, because I don't know how useful the templates are really, because people think, well, that's the way it is. But in reality, for my guys who are benching 4 plates, squatting 5, pulling 6 and more, that's a very bare bones basic workout. They would be doing a lot more. Okay, so they'd be doing a lot more volume. Their volume totals would be right up in the 16 to 20 range. So as a result, the workout looks a lot longer. They would probably also do some specific movement prep warmths as well, just to keep them safe. So as it is, when you're trying to reach those elite levels of strength, you don't do that via minimalistic routines. It just doesn't happen. So the example I gave you is just sort of a template which you might want to, it might help you visualize what I'm talking about. That's all. So hopefully that add-on was useful, and I'll definitely call it there. Take care.